on first block. Okay, so the first texture we're going to do is wood. So I'm just going to write wood. Yep. And now we're talking about, so for this first one, we're looking at if you had like a 2x4 that's been cut the long way, we're looking at the grain of the wood, all right? So how we do that is I like to start, personally, with some V's. Okay? And then wood grain is kind of pretty random. So it gets close and it goes far away. You'll have an oval shape for a knot, and then it just goes around that. You might have another like kind of a V here where the grain just kind of comes. So wood grain is about wiggly lines, knots, and the wiggly lines go around the knots. You'll have some that go close, some that go far away. All right, I'm going to keep going here. So then with your blending stick, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trace along those lines that I drew, and it's just going to make it have a little bit of shadow, which is going to feel like the wood has a little more depth to it, okay? Wood too, actually. So for this one, we're going to do as if we took a slice of wood, you know, a circle like a slice, and we're looking down at it. This one's very easy. So typically in the center of the tree, you'll have a core, and it's sort of just an organic kind of ovally shape, but it's not a perfect oval, okay? Then, do you know what a dashed line is? Like a dash, break, okay, woo. You're just gonna trace around that in a circular motion, and some of your dashes are going to be long and some are going to be short. Okay? So just make it varied. You see that? You can get bigger as they go out further. And this is just the rings of the tree. So we start with that. Then, a lot of trees, if you've cut a slice of a tree, they dry really fast and kind of randomly, so you'll get some little cracks that go horizontally. So I like to come in and I like to just add a few little like crack marks going the other direction. Okay? Okay, the next one we're going to do is bark. We're really hitting these trees hard today. Now bark is a similar texture to the inside of the grain. And that's because if you imagine the inside of the grain is going to kind of match the bark, because that's just building from the outside in. However, it's a little looser than the inside grain. Okay? So when I do bark, I'm going to kind of do these long broken lines again. Kind of wiggly. And then you can definitely add in a knot, because usually the knots are pretty dark and they show up really easily. Okay, for this one I do like to use my blending stick, and I go and I kind of continue to blend that out a little bit. And I do that because if you think about a maple tree, the bark has these like thick, kind of chunky pieces that are pretty random. Grass, but it's also hair because grass and hair looks very similar when you're only doing a square of texture and you don't have the rest of the picture to see the differences, okay? So with grass or hair, it's really important to be pretty random. So have variety in your line. That means thicker lines, thinner lines, shorter lines, like longer lines. So grass or hair grows out of the ground or the scalp and it comes up. So what I do is I just make some small, some short, some long. I make sure that I overlap, but I make sure that they grow out. So I start down and I go up, okay? I like to add in some really small little pieces too, because I feel like that gives texture. And then what I do with grass is I take my blending stick and I don't trace each line that I do. Instead, I go and I just, almost as if I'm drawing with a pencil, I just draw a few lines in there and it takes some of the graphite from what I already laid down and it just adds like almost a shadow of the grass. So I just kind of go like this. I'm not like picking lines in particular. I just sort of do it real fast. Little bit. Scales. Okay? So this one is scales. So how I start scales is I just do use. Now one thing you have to remember about scales is you have to start on the top layer and then you have to make all the other layers look like they're coming out from underneath. So make sure that you don't go over that line. I kind of stagger it a little bit, and it doesn't have to be staggered perfectly by any means. But these scales, this could be fish scales, it could be reptile scales, it could be like those clay shingles on a roof. Now, this is the fun part. This is what makes scales really look like scales. So you take your blending stick, and I'm going to take that line, and I'm going to shade it underneath the scale. So I want to make sure that the top scale stays white. Now this is like the shadow, because if these scales are really overlapping each other, like they should be, the shadow would show up underneath. Okay, then I go to the next row and I do it to that one too, underneath. So do you see how that shadow really just makes them look three-dimensional, like they're overlapped? So when you don't have the shadow, they look flat still. Do you see? But just by tracing that shadow under there, it really makes it look more three-dimensional. Next one is scales number 2. So implying scales would be to have patches of them. Okay, and they can be random. They don't really look like scales yet, but remember, implied scales. So once I have those little loops drawn in, then I can come in with my thing and I can imply a little bit easier with my blending stick.
What? Yeah.
Okay, so it's really about kind of just implying that they're there and not necessarily drawing each individual scale in. Lumps are next. Now lumps, I hate that word. I think it's just a weird, gross word, but it can be used for a ton of different things. So that's just the best way to describe it. So what I do for lumps is lumps grow out of whatever they're in. So I'm just going to do a few little, some like multiple lumps, some little lumps. And then I take my tool and I'm actually going to shade onto the lump. Okay, now let me give you some ideas of when you might use the lump texture. So obviously if you're drawing like a witch with like warts, you would use lump. But if you're drawing succulents, the plant, you know, like a succulent, this would be great. If you're drawing a landscape and you've got bushes and bushes and like rock formations, you might use a lump texture. When else do you think you might use a lump texture? Can you think of anything? All right, bumps. Now lumps, I think of like warts, like big lumpy grossness, right? But bumps, I think of things like if I'm drawing a gravel road, like I'm drawing down a gravel road, you might have some little bumps in the road from like where the road changes or where there's big rocks or ruts or whatever. This is also one that you can use for water. So sometimes you get a bumpy texture for water. All right, so I just kind of start and then I kind of even out. And so bumps are just like little swoopy, nothing extreme, like so, okay? And then I like to take my tool and I like to just go over it, over the line that I drew. And obviously, whatever you're drawing with bumps is going to drastically change how you shade or give value or color or whatever you're doing. But you see how this could be water, or it could be just like a ground. It could be a landscape looking far away at the horizon line. Could be a bumpy texture. So spikes is next. We're going to do short little spikes. So first you have to think about spikes coming out of like a skin, or maybe this is a cactus, little cactus spikes. So they come out of something, so you need to have straight where it's coming out of the skin, but it can point different directions. We just want to do little triangles. But then, how I make it look like it's coming out of something is I take my blending stick and I don't trace the whole thing. What I do is I only go right where it would touch the skin. So I just do right underneath. I can be kind of loose with it, give it like a shadow. But do you see how that looks more like it's coming out of something, having that shadow there? Okay, we're going to do spikes number 2. Another kind of spikes. Now this spike is a 3-dimensional spike. So I think of a pyramid, okay? So I'm going to draw a tall triangle. And then I draw a little line that goes up diagonally. And then I match it up to the top of the point. So I'll show you again. I do a tall triangle, a little bit of a diagonal line, and then match that up to the top. I like to shade the smaller side because what we know about value is if it was a 3D form, and that was a side, that wouldn't be, the light wouldn't be hitting both sides. So one of them would be a little darker than the other. And then I also like to go in, just like I did with this one, and put where it meets that ground or skin, whatever it is. Because I feel like that just makes it look a little more like it's coming out of something. There's rocks. Rocks. Now my trick with rocks is this. So we want organic shapes, okay? Because rocks are not perfectly circular. Now think about like river rock. It can be washed over and over in the river and it makes it nice and smooth and round. But even that, it's not always perfectly round, right? So we want to have some organic shapes. I like to draw rocks so that they're almost touching each other. And I leave just a little bit of space in between them because our rocks are 3-dimensional forms. So there's going to be some shadow in between the rocks. All right? You can do little ones, you can do big ones. Whatever shapes you want. Just leave a little bit of space in between them. And then, once you have a little bit of space in between them and you've got all your rocks drawn in, you're going to go in and you're going to shade that space in between. Just nice and lightly. Okay, once I get all that filled in, then I take my blending stick and I'm going to smooth that between. Then I take a little bit of graphite that's on my blending stick, and now rocks are 3-dimensional. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to just add in a little bit of shadow on my rock. And what that does is it just gives it a little bit of 3-dimensionality. I'm not going to like trace the whole rock, I'm just going to add it to one side of the rock. And I want it to be nice and light. That will make it look like the rocks are not just flat, just like cut flat, you know? See? and then I'm going to take my blending stick, and without doing every single line, I'm just going to randomly, as if I'm drawing more lines, go through and just do a few. And what that's going to do is it's going to fill in some of that depth in between the hair. Fluffy, but also feathers. I wrote that really silly, sorry. Fluffy feathers. So when I do this one, I think of like the smaller feathers on like a quail or a turkey, yep, or a pheasant, or fluffy like sheep, okay? So, but if it was zoomed super far in. So we're gonna do these big, but if you were gonna draw a sheep, you would probably do these really small all over. Does that make sense? So instead of taking our time to do like 1,000 of them on here to make it small and look realistic, we're pretending we're zooming it in, okay? So it's just gonna be some bumps here. Okay, and then we come in with our blending stick, and I scumble around that to give that kind of a soft texture. Now, if you did this in a very small scale, it would look like fluffy sheep. You know what I'm saying? Or like the down feathers, the little soft fluffy feathers of a bird. The next one is spikes 3. We got more spikes going on here. This one to me is more of like a cactus shape, or maybe like the way you might do a random like mountains or like bluffs in the distance, okay? So I kind of come up like this, and I just make pointy spikes, like so. Then, when I have those drawn in, I like to come in and do just some lines on there. I think of cactus, and usually it has some of those lines. And then I don't blur or blend the outside shape because I want that to be spiky. I want it to be sharp. But I might come in and just trace just these center lines just a little bit to give it a little more depth. A little more value in there makes it look a little more three-dimensional. Slime. All right, slime, and have it dripping. Doing. Okay, then I take my blending stick, and like I did with my scales, where I went underneath to show the shadow, that's what we want to do. We want to go underneath that line, leaving the top nice and clean. And that's going to be showing the shadow of the slime. Okay, but we're not done yet. After you do your shadow, if you think about slime being like a runny consistency, typically that would reflect light easier because it would be more wet. If it's going to be able to run, it's got to have some fluidity to it. So what I like to do then is I like to make some little kind of like reflection lines on here, and I don't trace all of it. I just do like a few little marks, and that kind of shows that it's like dripping down. Make sense? I don't do too many, because too many makes it feel almost like you just traced it again, you know? You just want a few to hint that it's this running goop. Last one that we're going to do on here is hair 3, but also wire. So it's more of a wiry hair, a curly, kind of coarse, wiry hair. But you can also use it for bushes, for anything like that kind of is all clumped together but has definition in it. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to make some scumbly lines, and I'm just going to keep overlapping them. I'm going to vary my pencil line from being skinny to being thick, so that's varying my line variety. My blending stick, I don't trace each line, but I just scumble right over the top of it, and that's going to instantly just give me a little more depth in there. And I don't want to do too much because I don't want to like color it in. I just want like a few scumble lines.